Millions watched as Jasmine Crockett stood, calm, unshaken, and confronted Chief Justice John Roberts in a congressional hearing that stunned the nation. He looked her dead in the eye and called someone unqualified. Hours later, he claimed it wasn't about her, but Jasmine didn't let it slide. She exposed the truth, leaving the most powerful judge in America cornered, silent, and unable to defend the weight of his own words. Now the country is asking, if she was so unqualified, why was she the only one brave enough to speak the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 2175 of the Rayburn House office building had never felt heavier. The marble walls stood silent witnesses to what would become one of the most explosive hearings in congressional memory. The room, packed with reporters, legal scholars, and spectators, buzzed with quiet anticipation. At the center sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his posture regal, his expression unreadable. To his right, seated with calm intensity, was Representative Jasmine Crockett, her black blazer sharply pressed, a small gold cross gleaming at her neck, and a folder thick with documents in her hands. She waited for her turn, her eyes not on the cameras, not even on her notes, but fixed directly on the man whose decisions had shaped the nation's most powerful court. When her name was called, she rose slowly, as if stepping into combat. "Mr. Chief Justice," she began, voice steady but firm, "I believe the American people deserve to know if the Supreme Court still answers to the law, or to the donors behind closed doors." There was a flicker of something behind Robert's eyes, a twitch maybe, or just the ghost of a smirk. But he said nothing. Jasmine continued, flipping open the folder. "You've accepted invitations to private retreats funded by groups who later filed amicus briefs in front of your court. You've failed to disclose gifts that, by any civilian standard, would raise red flags. And yet, this body is told to trust that your honor is its own safeguard?" The room grew stiller with every word. When lower courts are bound by codes of conduct, but the highest court is not, that's not balance. That's untouchable power. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried with the weight of every voice that had gone unheard in front of that court. She laid down one final statement like a gavel strike. "Isn't justice supposed to be blind, not selectively mute?" Robert slowly adjusted his mic, pausing as if calculating the exact weight of what he would say next. His hands folded neatly before him, a gesture rehearsed in decades of courtroom decorum. When he finally spoke, it was not in outrage nor in haste. His tone was surgical, cold and smooth. "Congresswoman," he said, locking eyes with her, "I don't believe individuals who have not earned the requisite legal and constitutional gravitas should attempt to lecture the Supreme Court on ethics." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Then came the line that detonated the room. "Frankly, I don't think people who are unqualified should be preaching morality to the High Court." The silence didn't just linger, it took over. It settled into the corners of the room like fog, thick and unmoving, pressing down on every breath, every blink, every thought. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. No one in room 2175 dared to speak. Not the aides, not the chairperson, not even the reporters, whose fingers hovered motionless above their keyboards, too stunned to type. The weight of Robert's words still hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Unqualified. A single word that cracked through the air like a gunshot muffled in velvet, calculated enough to wound, but vague enough to escape consequence. All eyes, instinctively and silently, turned to Jasmine Crockett, because in that lineup of polished suits, flag pins, and congressional authority, she was the only black woman seated at the dais. And now the room was waiting to see if she would erupt, fold, or disappear. But she didn't do any of that. She sat completely still, unmoving, unbothered, unreadable. Her shoulders didn't stiffen. Her hands didn't ball into fists. Instead, she lowered her eyes back to her documents, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than any voice. One by one, she flipped to the next page in her binder, with the kind of casual care that made everyone else in the room suddenly aware of how hard they were holding their breath. She picked up her pen and calmly resumed writing something in the margin, as if nothing had been said at all. As if the most powerful judge in the country hadn't just tried to publicly reduce her to silence with one backhanded sentence. Her face remained perfectly composed, but her silence wasn't retreat. It was control. It was the kind of control that came from surviving rooms colder than this one, crueler than this one, far more dishonest than this one. 10 seconds passed, but in the world of live politics, 10 seconds of silence might as well be an eternity. People shifted in their seats. The tension became a character in the room. Even Chief Justice Roberts subtly adjusted the clasp of his hands, as if the chill in her silence had reached him too. And then finally she moved. With a precision so deliberate it felt like choreography, Jasmine placed her pen down beside her notepad. She lifted her head, not quickly, not with flair, but with the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Her eyes met his. No tremble, no heat, no panic. Her expression wasn't anger. It was something colder, something that spoke of years of being underestimated, of being questioned, of being measured by standards that shifted every time she rose to meet them. "Chief Justice," she said, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel through silk. "For the sake of clarity, because clarity matters in a courtroom, doesn't it?" She let the question hang, rhetorical but weighted. "When you said, 'I don't think people who are unqualified should preach morality to the High Court,' I'd like to ask you directly." Her eyes didn't blink. "Were you referring to me?" She waited, but not long. "Because when I look around this room, I don't see anyone else who meets the description your eyes were locked on when you said it." And then, one final line, soft as a whisper, but sharper than any gavel. "So I'll ask again, Chief Justice, did you mean me?" The question had been asked with terrifying clarity, and now it hovered in the air like a guillotine suspended by silence. "Did you mean me?" Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her calmness was a loaded gun on the table, one everyone could see but no one dared touch. And yet, instead of meeting the moment with honesty, or even with the kind of veiled dignity that had kept him above political noise for decades, Chief Justice John Roberts reached for the safest defense in the book: deflection. He leaned slightly forward, fingers laced, tone polished and deliberately vague. "My statement was meant to reflect general standard," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, like marble covering rot. "It was not directed at any particular individual." The words sounded clean, but they were slippery, designed not to answer, but to escape. The problem was, the room had seen it. Everyone had. The timing, the angle of his eyes, the way the sentence had landed, like a scalpel aimed with surgical intent. And now, here he was, pretending it was academic, pretending it was theoretical, pretending that the blade hadn't just sliced across the only black woman in the room, right in front of an entire nation. Jasmine sat motionless for a breath, then another, and then she leaned forward. Just a bit. Enough to close the distance without threatening, enough to speak not with force but with precision. "Chief Justice," she said, "I asked a question, and instead of answering it, you stepped behind a wall of abstraction and hoped we'd all politely nod." Her voice remained steady, her face unreadable, but her words struck with the weight of stone. "That's not clarity. That's cowardice dressed up in legal syntax." Roberts blinked, once, twice. His fingers shifted slightly on the table. The man who had stood before presidents, who had wielded words like instruments in landmark rulings, was now staring at a woman half his age who refused to flinch, who refused to be gaslit into silence. "If this were a courtroom," Jasmine continued, voice unwavering, "you would demand an answer on the record. And yet here, in front of Congress, you dodge with semantics." Her eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something more dangerous: focus. "If I, as a sitting member of this body, can be targeted, intentionally or not, and the moment I press for clarity, the Chief Justice hides behind vague principles, then what does that say to every person who doesn't have a microphone in front of them?" The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulled taut across opposing ships. No one looked away. No one breathed too loud. And Roberts hesitated, His reply came slower now, no longer lined with confidence. "Congresswoman, I believe you may have misunderstood," he began, but even he seemed unsure of where the sentence was going. It trailed slightly at the edges, unconvincing even to his own ears. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to, because the power had already moved. The balance had already shifted. For the first time in the hearing, Roberts wasn't the one commanding the space. He was defending himself inside it, and the rest of the room knew it too. The chairman didn't gavel, the aides didn't murmur. The press gallery remained frozen. It wasn't decorum holding them still. It was gravity. The gravity of watching a moment that wasn't just about Robert's words or Jasmine's question. It was about what happened when someone who had always been on the outside walked into the most sacred hall of American power and refused to be quiet. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was forming, and every person in that room could feel it coming. She had given him every chance. She had asked the question with precision, waited through the silence, even endured the deflection. But now Jasmine Crockett was done waiting. With a calmness that felt more dangerous than any raised voice, she reached down, tapped her tablet, and brought it to life. The glow of the screen reflected off her hands as rows of information unfolded, tidy columns of names, dates, and monetary figures, each one a thread in a web few had dared to pull. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the tablet toward the committee. The room leaned in. "Let's not talk in circles," she said. "Let's look at some facts." Her voice was even, but it had changed. There was an edge now, like someone tired of asking for permission to be heard. She scrolled down the screen without looking away from Roberts. "The Liberty Civic Foundation," she began. "You gave a speech at their retreat in Aspen on June 14th. 3 months later, they filed a legal brief in the Randall versus Zenith case, which your court ruled on, and you voted in their favor. Would you like to tell this committee who paid for your travel and hotel during that event? Because, according to their own financial records, they covered everything for special judicial guests." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed like a weight, slow and deliberate. "That ruling changed environmental laws across the country, and now we find out that the group who benefited flew the Chief Justice out to a private resort to talk behind closed doors." She tapped again. Another entry came up. "Let's talk about Forward Horizons," she said. "July 9th, Washington, D.C. Hilton, a private legal summit. You were the keynote speaker. On the invite list were CEOs from 5 major tech companies. All of them had cases coming up in federal court." She paused just long enough for the silence to bite. "Do you think it's wrong to ask why a Supreme Court justice is spending weekends talking privately with people whose companies have lawsuits that depend on your vote?" Her words were steady, her face unreadable, but the force behind her calm was unmistakable. "Tell me this," she continued, eyes locked on his. "Who exactly is the one that's not qualified? The person bringing these details forward? Or the one whose name keeps showing up at meetings with billion-dollar interests, and then shows up again in rulings that help those same interests?" Her voice was cool, her delivery clean. "Because if asking these questions makes me unqualified, then maybe what you're really saying is, people like me shouldn't be asking them at all." The next slide lit up. "Here's a flight log from October, a private jet registered to Crestview Holdings. They were involved in a major commerce case your court chose not to hear. Just days before that decision, you attended a private event sponsored by that same company in Arizona." She raised an eyebrow. "Should we believe that's just a coincidence?" She leaned in just slightly. "This isn't guesswork. It's public records. It's your name, their money, your vote, and a pattern that keeps repeating." Another pause. Her voice softened, but cut deeper. "So if you think I'm the one who doesn't belong here, then tell me, does being qualified mean staying quiet while all this goes on?" She lowered her voice one last time, almost to a whisper, but it carried through the room like a drum beat. "Because from where I sit, being qualified means having the guts to ask the questions no one else will." And then she said nothing more, because she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. The silence no longer belonged to Roberts. It belonged to her. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved an inch since she began reading. She didn't need to. The weight of her words did the moving for her. Across the long, polished hearing table, Chief Justice John Roberts sat completely still, but something beneath the surface had shifted. His grip on the edge of his chair had tightened visibly, his fingers white at the knuckles. The skin stretched taut like a man trying to anchor himself in a storm he could no longer control. The mask of judicial confidence, the practiced neutrality, the carefully measured tone, was cracking in slow motion. His shoulders, once squared in pride, had begun to draw inward ever so slightly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. Because Jasmine wasn't making accusations. She was unearthing evidence. And with every line she read, another inch of the myth surrounding him was peeled away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. There was no need for theatrics. She simply scrolled, paused, and read. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but what came out of her mouth had the precision of a scalpel and the weight of a sledgehammer. June 14th, she began again. Aspen, Colorado. You spoke at a retreat held by the Liberty Civic Foundation. They flew you in, covered all your expenses through a donor fund. Then 3 months later, they submitted a brief to the court in the Randall versus Zenith case, and you voted in their favor. She turned a page. July 9th, you attended a private summit at the D.C. Hilton, hosted by Forward Horizons. Tech executives with cases before your court were there. You gave the keynote speech. Their group reimbursed your travel. That's not guessing, that's paperwork. She looked up just for a second, long enough to meet his eyes and make sure he was still listening. Really listening. He was. His jaw was tight now, mouth closed so firmly it looked like he was holding something in. But there was nothing left to hold. She looked back down. October 2nd, she continued. Scottsdale, Arizona. Crestview Holdings hosted an event. You flew there on their private jet. Tail number 5, XKZL. 3 days later, the court refused to hear Fletcher versus Commerce, a case that directly affected Crestview's business. You were the final vote in that decision. Jasmine paused, not because she was unsure, but because she knew the weight of silence now belonged to her too. Then softly she continued. May 18th. You were a guest at a Rhodes Civic Trust dinner in Chicago. That group funded a brief for Trent Veer, federal commission case, ruled on by your court a few weeks later. Again, 5-4. Again, your vote made the difference. She closed the screen for a moment, folded her hands and rested them gently on the table. Not a single word had been shouted, but the hearing room now felt as if it were made of glass, tight, fragile, one sharp movement away from shattering. Still, Robert said nothing. His face was pale now, his hands clasped tighter, elbows resting more heavily against the leather arms of his chair. And Jasmine? Jasmine didn't even smile. She wasn't performing. She wasn't campaigning. She was stating what needed to be heard, in the one place where it was hardest to say it. Her restraint was more powerful than outrage, her facts more devastating than accusations, and she knew it. So tell me, Chief Justice, she said finally, her voice steady, clear, and quiet enough to make the room lean in. When you told me I wasn't qualified to talk about ethics, was that really about qualifications? She let that question hang, not for effect, but because sometimes the silence after truth is louder than anything else. The silence didn't crack. It didn't shift. It settled, like dust after an explosion, like the breath held too long in a room that had forgotten how to exhale. For several long suspended moments, no one moved. Not the clerks, not the aides, not the rows of lawmakers flanking the dais. All eyes remained locked on the space between Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts, where something irreversible had just unfolded. He had come into that room cloaked in tradition, carrying the weight of an institution that rarely gets questioned, much less cornered. But now that cloak looked thinner, almost transparent, and the weight felt like it had shifted shoulders. Roberts was no longer the man asking questions. He was the man answering them, or at least the man trying not to. And everyone in the room could feel the imbalance shift like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. She had done what no gavel or robe or chamber rule could accomplish. She had changed the gravity of the room. What began as an exchange between a justice and a congresswoman had become something far more raw, far more dangerous, a reckoning. And when she finally spoke again, It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, tired maybe, but deeply rooted in something that had taken a lifetime to form. Her voice was steady and low, the kind of tone that forces people to lean in, not to hear better, but to feel what's behind the words. If our definition of ethics, she said slowly, is something that keeps people like me out, people who ask uncomfortable questions, who come from places not built for power, then maybe it's not a definition worth protecting. She let that sit, not for applause, not for acknowledgement, but because sometimes the truth has to be held in silence so its shape can be fully understood. Her eyes didn't leave Robert's. Her tone didn't soften. But what came next felt less like a challenge and more like a quiet revelation. If calling for transparency makes me unqualified, she said, each word clear, then we've forgotten what qualification is supposed to mean. Her hands rested still on the table. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't performing. She was just telling the truth, the kind that no room, no robe, no title can fully prepare for. Maybe being qualified doesn't mean being approved by the old rules. Maybe it means being brave enough to question them, especially when those rules have never protected people like me. No one dared interrupt. Even the creak of leather chairs had stopped. The chairman, stoic until now, glanced down, nodded once, and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to add, but because nothing needed to be added. The air was thick with understanding, a kind of invisible agreement that what had just happened wasn't routine, wasn't procedural. It was real. The kind of moment that rewrites where power sits in a room. There were no cameras flashing, no clapping hands, no breaking news banners just yet. But something fundamental had already changed, not just in the hearing, but in every person who had watched what Jasmine Crockett just did. She didn't flip the table. She didn't burn the institution. She just held it accountable. And in doing so, reminded the entire room what real qualification looks like. The words had landed, the balance had shifted, and the silence had taken on a new weight. But just as the room began to adjust to that gravity, Chief Justice John Roberts stirred. Slowly, as if he'd felt the tide turn too late, he leaned toward his microphone. His movements were smaller now, more hesitant, measured not in confidence but in damage control. The tone in his voice had lost its marble polish. It was uncertain, brittle around the edges. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, clearing his throat as though it might wash away the moment. I acknowledge that my earlier remark could have been phrased more carefully. It was not my intention to cause offense. A pause and then, the truth is, I was referring to someone else, a staff legal advisor, not you. He said it quietly, like someone hoping a softer delivery would soften the blow. But no one in the room exhaled. No one leaned back in relief, because what he had just offered wasn't a resolution, it was a retreat. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. Her brow furrowed, but not with surprise. She had seen this move before. A man of power speaking in technicalities, hoping ambiguity would patch the wound that clarity had opened. She didn't rush to respond. She let the words hang in the air, rot in it. Then calmly, with precision, she leaned forward and answered in a tone so even, it carried the sharpness of a knife still in its sheath. Chief Justice, she said, her voice steady, what you just said, that actually makes it worse. Her words didn't explode. They landed, soft, controlled, but devastating. Because if you weren't talking about me, then you knew I misunderstood. You watched as I responded to what I believed was an attack on my character, on my integrity, and you said nothing. She paused, not to dramatize, but to let the truth sink like an anchor. You let me take the hit. You let the insult live in the room, and you didn't step in to correct it. Not when the whole country was watching. Not when I had to stand here and defend my right to even be sitting in this chair. Her hands remained still on the table. She didn't need to gesture. The room was already holding its breath. Then came the moment that no one expected. But that changed everything. One of the committee aides, seated near the media monitors, quietly turned the volume up on a screen replaying the live stream. It was muted, but everyone could see the image. The timestamp was clear. The camera angle was fixed. And there he was, Chief Justice Roberts, leaning forward, making the exact statement in question. And his eyes? Locked directly on Jasmine Crockett. Not glancing, not casual, focused, deliberate. The truth wasn't in what he said, it was in who he said it to. No one needed the audio. The footage said everything. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Her silence in that moment wasn't surrender. It was confirmation. It was the kind of silence you only offer when the evidence has spoken louder than you ever could. The kind of silence that doesn't need a closing argument because the facts have already reached their destination. Slowly, she turned her head toward Roberts, and for the first time since he had arrived, his composure faltered. His shoulders tensed. His eyes flickered down toward the table. His mouth tightened, but no words came. What apology could survive a moment like that? Then Jasmine spoke, quietly, and with the full weight of everything that had just unfolded. "You watched me get targeted by your words," she said, "and you chose to let me carry that weight alone." Her voice was soft, but every syllable hit like stone dropped into still water. "And now, after all that, you want to pretend it wasn't about me?" She paused. "You didn't just say something careless. You let the lie grow, and you let me bleed for it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him of anything beyond what everyone had already seen. She simply named the silence, named the moment, named the failure. And the room responded not with shock, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when people realize they've just watched someone refuse to be erased. And then came the silence, the real silence. Not the uncomfortable pause between arguments, not the breath before rebuttal, but the silence that settles like dust after something breaks. A silence that no apology could clean up. A silence that no clarification could reverse. The kind of silence that makes people look at power differently because they've seen it blink, seen it stammer, seen it try to rewrite its own intent and fail. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't press. She simply looked back down at her notes, tapped her tablet screen once, and closed the file. Her job was done. She hadn't come to perform. She came to hold someone accountable. And now everyone in the room, on the dais, in the gallery, behind the cameras, understood exactly what had just happened. The most powerful judge in the country had spoken, but it was her silence that echoed. The silence after the live stream replay wasn't just damning, it was complete. The illusion had shattered, the footage had spoken, and for the first time that morning, John Roberts no longer looked like a man in control of the room. He looked like a man who had just watched a mask fall and didn't know how to put it back on. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting just across from him, didn't move to twist the knife. Instead, she turned inward, her expression shifting not to triumph, but to memory. Her posture straightened, her eyes lowered for a beat, and then she looked up, not at him this time, but past him, past the cameras, past the polished mahogany panels and into something deeper, older, harder. She spoke not to win the moment, but to tell the truth of how she got here. "There's something you should know," she began, her voice lower now, not quiet but full of weight. "When I was 19, I was arrested for the first time. The room didn't move, not a whisper, not a rustle. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't stealing, I wasn't causing chaos. I was standing outside a courthouse in Dallas, protesting the sentencing of a teenage boy, black like me, who'd been given 25 years for stealing a jacket. A jacket. While a white boy from a private school down the road got probation for assault, I held a sign. I chanted his name, and that's all it took." Her eyes didn't blink. Her jaw didn't shake. She was calm, but in the way a storm is calm just before the break. "They told me I was trespassing. They said I was disruptive. They cuffed me and pushed me into a cruiser like I was dangerous. My mom didn't have money for a lawyer. We didn't have friends in the system. All we had was our last name, and that didn't mean much." She exhaled slowly. "The charges were dropped eventually, but the record stayed. For years. Every internship I applied for, every job I interviewed for. That arrest came up first, before my GPA, before my class rank, before me." The tension in the room was no longer between her and Roberts. It was between her past and their perception. That moment changed me. It didn't make me angry. It made me determined. I didn't go to law school to become part of the system that did that to me. I went to law school so I could take that system apart and rebuild it in the name of people who never get to speak in rooms like this one. Her voice grew more measured with every word. I studied not just to argue the law, but to understand its cracks, the gaps where bias hides, the corners where silence protects the powerful and buries the vulnerable. She leaned forward, not for emphasis, but because the weight of what she was saying demanded proximity. You see, people like me, we're told we're not enough before we even start. Too loud, too emotional, too angry, too black, and always, always too unqualified. So I know exactly what it means when a man in power looks across the room at a woman like me and uses those words. I've heard them since I was a child. She turned back to Roberts, now meeting his gaze fully again. I've lived a whole life being told I don't belong. But today I'm the one sitting behind this microphone. And the man who questioned my place, he's the one hiding behind a robe. The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They just sat there, massive and still, like stone blocks dropped onto marble floors. Across the table, Robert's face was unreadable, but not cold. Not anymore. The chill that had once lingered in his expression was gone, replaced by something far more difficult to process. Hollowness. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. His face had softened in a way that suggested not realization, but resignation, as if he'd finally felt the size of the moment and knew he couldn't rise to meet it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't press the advantage. She simply let her words settle in the room, heavy as justice that had waited too long. Her eyes dropped back to her notes, but she didn't read them. Her hand hovered above the page like she was still living in that memory, still holding the sign outside that courthouse. Still 19, still cuffed. But now she was here, and everything she had fought through, the arrest, the doubt, the rooms where she wasn't welcome, had led to this one. I didn't come here today to be comfortable, she said at last, her voice softening. I came here to be honest. And nothing in that room could stand against it. The room was still holding its breath from the weight of her story. Every syllable Jasmine Crockett had spoken, about being cuffed for protesting injustice, about clawing her way into the law not to belong to it, but to challenge it, had settled into the air like dust that refused to be swept away. Chief Justice Roberts hadn't responded, couldn't. His silence now was no longer commanding. It was revealing. The power that once wrapped around him like armor had faded, leaving only the outline of a man who once controlled every room he entered. Now he was motionless, stuck inside the hollow echo of what he hadn't said, of what he had let happen. And Jasmine, across from him, didn't look triumphant. She looked finished, not exhausted, complete. She didn't need anything more from him. Not an apology, not a gesture, not a correction, because what needed to be said had already been said. She didn't reach for her notes. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't make any move that would dull the final edge of what she was about to leave behind. Instead, she straightened in her chair, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet resolve that felt older than the institution itself. Her hands rested on the table one last time. Then she rose, gracefully, deliberately, standing not as someone concluding a hearing, but as someone stepping out of a fire she had walked through on her own terms. The movement itself sent a wave through the room, like a shift in pressure that made everyone suddenly aware of their posture, their silence, their complicity. Every person in that chamber knew they were witnessing something that would not be forgotten, something that couldn't be undone. Jasmine's eyes didn't linger on Roberts. She didn't wait for him to look up. Instead, she spoke clearly, not to him, not to the committee, but to history. Her voice was calm, firm, and final. Being qualified, she said, isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you. There was no tremble in her tone, no hesitation, just the cold, undeniable truth of someone who had lived every inch of that sentence. She wasn't asking for permission. She was claiming space, space that generations before her had been denied, and that she now stood in fully, without apology. Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They carved themselves into the silence, into the walls, into the memory of every person sitting in that chamber. She didn't look back at Roberts to see if he understood, because it no longer mattered if he did. The moment had passed him. The country had seen it, and Jasmine Crockett had already moved on from it. Not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had told the truth in a place built to obscure it, and stood tall when others stayed seated. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, packed with everything no one dared say out loud. No murmurs, no movement. No one shifted in their seat or reached for a pen. Even the chairman, who had gavel authority, didn't speak, didn't blink. The entire hearing room, so used to noise, to arguments, to carefully scripted power plays, was now still, respectfully still. Not out of politeness, but out of awe, because they all knew what had just happened. The person who had been questioned, dismissed, underestimated, targeted, had left standing, not metaphorically, literally, while the most powerful judicial figure in the country remained frozen in his chair, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a table that no longer offered him protection. Jasmine didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need a soundbite for the cameras. What she needed, she had already given herself: the truth. And in that moment, that truth was all that mattered. It stood taller than the dais, louder than the gavel, more enduring than the robes. She walked slowly, not with the stiffness of confrontation, but with the confidence of closure. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step a punctuation mark that needed no translation. Each step said, "I am not afraid of these walls. I do not owe them anything, and I do not need them to recognize my worth." Behind her, Roberts remained seated, his face unreadable, his hands still folded, tighter now. But it wasn't dignity that kept him in that seat. It was weight, the weight of a silence that had arrived too late, the weight of a robe that no longer shielded him, the weight of being watched, not as a guardian of law, but as a man who had been given the chance to stand for something and chose not to. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. And perhaps, most telling of all, he didn't deny what had just happened. Because how could he? The country had seen it, live, unfiltered, in real time. Outside the chamber, the buzz was already beginning. Whispers in hallways, texts lighting up screens, journalists blinking in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. But inside room 2175, none of that noise had arrived yet. Inside, there was only the sound of a woman's footsteps growing fainter as she walked away from the table, and a nation's understanding growing louder in her wake. She didn't turn back. Not once. Because people who know where they stand never have to look behind them. And Roberts, he never left his seat. But everyone watching knew exactly who had just stood up. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echo felt deafening. Inside room 2175, the stillness remained, almost sacred. Outside, however, the world had already begun to move. Jasmine didn't stop walking. Not for cameras, not for whispers, not even for the security detail that instinctively fell in beside her. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble corridor of the Rayburn House office building. Each step sounded louder than it should have, as if the building itself were listening. Her eyes were forward, her face calm. But behind her, a storm was gathering, not of weather, but of attention. The moment she turned the final corner into the main hallway, it hit her, not the press, not the chaos, the quiet. A crowd had formed, but there was no shouting, no frenzy, no flashbulbs, just a wave of bodies, staffers, reporters, passers-by, who parted to let her through, not because they were told to, but because something in them knew they had just witnessed history. Someone held up a phone, live streaming. She caught the words on the screen for just a second. She stood up. Another reporter whispered, not to her, but to a producer beside them, "I've never seen a hearing end like that." Still no one spoke directly to Jasmine, not yet. It was as if the power she carried hadn't fully dissipated from the room and was still radiating off her skin like heat after fire. Outside the building, the story had already exploded. On social media, the clip of her final statement was being reshared at dizzying speed. The moment she stood, the calm in her voice, the weight of her last words, being qualified isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you. Were already subtitled in a dozen languages. The image of her standing while Roberts sat frozen in place became an instant symbol. Someone posted a split screen. Her rising, him sinking. The caption read, "Truth doesn't wear robes." In a dorm room at Howard University, a freshman law student named Erica paused her exam prep to watch the clip. She didn't blink. She didn't move. When it ended, she whispered, "That's it. That's the reason I'm here." In a break room at a Chicago factory, a 58-year-old machinist who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before leaned forward toward the small TV and muttered, "Damn, that woman's got steel in her bones." In a news studio in New York, producers yelled over one another, "Clear the 6:30, this goes top of show." In a coffee shop in Oakland, in a courthouse in Philadelphia, in a mother's kitchen in Atlanta, people watched, and then they shared. Not just the clip, not just the quote, their stories. Watched a black woman take down the highest judge in the country with nothing but truth. I'm crying. I was told I wasn't qualified because of where I came from. Today I watched someone prove otherwise. My daughter just asked me what it means to be qualified. I showed her Jasmine's clip. She smiled for the first time in a week. By the time Jasmine reached the Capitol Rotunda, her phone had buzzed 31 times. She hadn't looked at it once. Inside the hearing room, staffers had begun to pack up. But something was different now. They moved more slowly, more carefully, like cleaning up after something sacred, not procedural. One junior staffer, new to the Hill, barely out of grad school, stood holding his folder, staring at Roberts. Not with anger, with awe, not at the Chief Justice, at the silence Jasmine had left behind. The silence that said, "Everything has changed now." Roberts hadn't moved. In the minutes after Jasmine left, he sat motionless, his hands still clasped in front of him, his eyes blank. The power that had once wrapped around him like a second skin had cracked, not by force, but by truth. A truth too calm to ignore, too still to deny. And it was spreading. CNN broke into programming. Developing now, a congressional hearing erupts into one of the most powerful moments in recent political memory. MSNBC. Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Chief Justice Roberts wasn't just political, it was personal. It was history. Fox News treaded carefully. Controversial exchange between Supreme Court Justice and Congresswoman draws fire, both ways. But even they couldn't avoid the visual. A woman rising, a man not responding. By evening, Shuck Crockett vs. Roberts had trended #1 worldwide. It was no longer a hearing, it was a reckoning. Back in her office, Jasmine finally sat down. The noise had reached the walls, but not her heart. Not yet. Her chief of staff placed a laptop in front of her, already queued with footage of the moment. Jasmine didn't press play. She already knew what happened. Instead, she looked out the window. The sky over Washington had shifted into a soft orange, dusk beginning to settle over the city like a sigh. For the first time that day, she exhaled, long, full, and quiet. She didn't feel victorious. That wasn't the word. She felt true, and that was enough. Across the country, it wasn't the words people remembered first. It was the stillness, the way she stood, the way she didn't ask to be respected. She demanded it without ever raising her voice. That stillness was being replayed in school assemblies, in living rooms, in college campuses, in union halls. People weren't just watching the wave. They were becoming it. In downtown Detroit, a group of young activists began printing posters that read, "She stood, so we will." In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon, title, "When Standing is the Only Answer." In Sacramento, an 11-year-old girl opened her school presentation with Jasmine's quote about being qualified. Her teacher cried. Jasmine hadn't set out to spark a movement. But then again, most movements aren't sparked by speeches. They're sparked by moments, when someone refuses to sit down. And this wasn't just a moment, it was a wave. And it was only beginning. They called it the moment that broke the robe. Not officially, of course. Not in legal briefs or committee reports. But across the country, in living rooms, lecture halls, barber shops, courthouse lobbies, Newsroom roundtables? People said it the way survivors speak of the moment a storm split the sky. And as the clip of Jasmine Crockett standing before Chief Justice John Roberts reached its 100 millionth view, America wasn't just reacting with admiration, it was dividing. The backlash came fast, but not in the way people expected. It didn't come for her, it came for him. Within 24 hours, the Supreme Court's Public Information Office released a terse, three-line statement. Chief Justice Roberts acknowledges the misunderstanding during the April 22nd hearing. He affirms his respect for all members of Congress and regrets any confusion that may have resulted. It landed with a dull thud. No apology, no ownership, just cold, bureaucratic distance. The internet didn't miss it. Regrets confusion, one headline read. He wasn't confused, he was caught. What followed was something far more intense than a PR blunder. It was an unraveling. At law schools across the country, professors scrapped their scheduled lectures to break down the hearing, frame by frame. Students stood up in crowded lecture halls and read Jasmine's words aloud, not as testimony, but as manifesto. In a viral TikTok, a law student from Howard said, "They've been teaching us legal ethics as if it were sacred. But what we just saw, that's what happens when you ask power to follow its own rules." Meanwhile, the legal blogosphere detonated. SCOTUS Watch published a searing editorial titled, "A Robe is Not a Shield, and It Never Should Have Been." An ethics professor from Yale wrote a thread viewed 10 million times. What Roberts failed to say, failed to own, failed to see, isn't just a mistake, it's a mirror, and America saw what it reflects. Even the normally reserved American Bar Association released a cautious statement. Recent events highlight the urgent need for a binding ethical code applicable to all justices. Then came the calls from Congress. Representative Mark Caldwell, a centrist Democrat from Illinois, issued a demand for a formal inquiry into Roberts' ties to private interest groups mentioned during the hearing. What began as a symbolic gesture turned into something bigger when 3 Republicans, under pressure from constituents, broke ranks and backed it. Cable news split down ideological lines, but even conservative anchors struggled to defend what the country had seen. Fox's top legal analyst admitted, even if you believe Roberts didn't intend the insult for Congresswoman Crockett, the failure to correct the perception in real time, that was devastating. He didn't just look arrogant, he looked afraid. On MSNBC, the framing was sharper. She stood up. He sat down. That's all the history books will remember. But not everyone was celebrating. In the darker corners of the internet, a predictable wave of attacks was unleashed on Jasmine. Some tried to paint her as disrespectful, grandstanding, or ungrateful. Others resurrected tired tropes, too emotional, too aggressive, too loud. A few anonymous sources leaked selectively edited clips, hoping to recast her as combative, unprofessional. But the effort didn't gain traction, because this time, the truth had receipts, and 100 million people had already seen them. The real backlash, the one that stuck, wasn't aimed at Jasmine's tone. It was aimed at the Supreme Court itself. For decades, the highest court in the land had operated without a formal ethics code. Justices weren't required to disclose many private meetings, honorariums, or trips. They were bound by personal discretion. But Jasmine's questions had turned discretion into exposure. Her tablet didn't just contain dates and names, it contained precedent. Now the country wanted answers. An independent watchdog group filed a formal Freedom of Information Act request seeking travel records for all 9 justices. The Washington Post's investigative unit began a series titled Justice and Influence, digging into years of private retreats and off-the-record legal summits. And in a stunning move, Senator Amy Grayson, a moderate with deep ties to the judiciary, announced bipartisan legislation, the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act. It would mandate mandatory annual disclosures for Supreme Court justices, ban gifts or trips paid for by organizations with pending cases, and create an independent ethics oversight board. Its nickname on the Hill? The Crockett Clause. In a press conference, Senator Grayson didn't mince words. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just call out a moment. She exposed a pattern. This isn't about vengeance. It's about accountability. Roberts, for his part, remained silent. No televised statements, no follow-up testimony, no media appearances. But silence wasn't protection anymore. Not when the country had seen him stare down a woman speaking truth, say nothing, and then claim it wasn't about her. The damage wasn't just reputational, it was institutional. Confidence in the Supreme Court plummeted to a record low, 41%, according to Gallup. In the legal community, something deeper shifted. Young lawyers began citing Crockett's hearing not just as commentary, but as case study. Professors across the country rewrote sections of their ethics curriculum. Legal podcasts debated the line between deference and duty. And in every corner of the culture, the phrase "she stood, he sat" became something more than a recap. It became a standard. One night, 2 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine appeared on a quiet late-night interview show. Not for a political panel, not for a campaign, just her, a chair, a microphone. The host asked gently, "Do you regret anything about that day?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "No, because if I hadn't stood up, I would have carried that silence for the rest of my life. And I'm done carrying things that don't belong to me." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They sat in that truth the way the country had sat with it the day she stood up. And somewhere across a city, or maybe across the country, someone was watching who had once been told they were unqualified. And in that moment, they knew. They weren't. They were just beginning. Months had passed since Jasmine Crockett stood in that hearing room and shifted the axis of power with a single sentence. The world had not stood still in the wake of her words, but it had changed direction. The Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act, once thought too bold, too confrontational, had passed the House with bipartisan support and cleared the Senate in a nail-biting 52-48 vote. For the first time in U.S. history, Supreme Court justices would be subject to legally binding ethics rules. The new oversight body created under the Act bore a name no one could ignore: the Crockett Commission on Judicial Accountability. It wasn't something Jasmine had asked for. She hadn't drafted the legislation. She hadn't campaigned for her name to be on it. But the truth was undeniable. She had earned it. Across the country, the moment she had stood was now part of something bigger than media cycles and trending hashtags. It had become curriculum. In law schools from Harvard to Howard, students analyzed the hearing not just for its legal implications, but for its moral architecture. One professor at Stanford opened her first lecture with a looped clip of Jasmine's now iconic line: "Being qualified isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you." She paused the video and said, "This is what integrity looks like. This is what resistance to institutional inertia sounds like. And this is why we're here." In courtrooms across America, young lawyers now cited the Crockett precedent in ethical challenge motions. Not a ruling, not a case, a moment, a statement, a stand. For many, Jasmine had become a symbol, but she refused to let herself be turned into an ornament. She kept showing up, quietly, consistently. Not for photo ops, not for interviews, but for people. She returned to the university where she had been arrested at 19 and gave a closed-door seminar to students of color entering pre-law. She told them, "The law will never love you, but that doesn't mean you don't belong inside it." She declined national awards. She rejected endorsement deals. But she accepted a small invitation from a community legal aid group in Flint, Michigan. When asked why she showed up to such a small organization, she said, "Because this is where justice starts. Not in courts, but in places that believe people deserve to be heard before they can afford to be heard." Meanwhile, Roberts never fully recovered. He continued his duties on the bench, but his presence in public life diminished. Every opinion he authored was now shadowed by one moment of silence, the day he said nothing when it mattered most. He was still Chief Justice, but to many his title no longer carried the weight it once did. It had been measured, and in that hearing room, found lacking. For Jasmine, though, something more profound had occurred. Her role in the public imagination was no longer just that of a congresswoman. She had become a North Star for what principled leadership looked like in a time of cynicism. In a televised town hall in Philadelphia, A high school student stood and asked her, "Do you ever feel scared?" Jasmine smiled softly and said, "Every day." But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just refusing to let fear do the talking. The room erupted. She didn't pause for applause. She waited, then finished. And every time you speak truth, even if your voice shakes, you make it easier for the next person to speak. Her words became part of school posters, graduation speeches, tattoo ink, murals on brick walls in neighborhoods that had never seen a politician speak their language, until she did. On the anniversary of the hearing, an artist in Brooklyn unveiled a painting of Jasmine standing beside her seat, back straight, chin lifted. The piece was titled Unrobed. Underneath, a plaque read, "She didn't just stand, she made standing a form of truth." And yet Jasmine never treated it like her moment. In every interview, she deflected credit. She named every name of those who'd come before her, who'd spoken up and been ignored, who'd been crushed by the weight of systems they never built but were forced to carry. She once said on radio, "I stood because so many others didn't get the chance. I'm just the echo of voices this country didn't listen to in time." And perhaps that's why her legacy endured. Not because she changed the system overnight, but because she reminded people they had the right to demand more from it. Because she refused to let titles silence truth. Because she didn't just speak the words, we all saw her live them. And in doing so, she left behind more than policy. She left behind a path, one not paved by approval, not guarded by robes, but cleared by the footsteps of a woman who decided one day to stand and never look back. And so, as the halls emptied and the headlines multiplied, something larger than legislation lingered, something deeper than politics or power. It was the question no camera could capture, no transcript could fully convey. What does it truly mean to be worthy? And who decides? In a world built to reward compliance, Jasmine Crockett did something dangerous. She refused to be quiet. Not in protest, not in outrage, but in truth. Cold, calm, inescapable truth. She didn't demand respect with volume or posture. She didn't beg for dignity. She embodied it. And in doing so, she exposed a fault line that runs through every institution, every courtroom, every boardroom and classroom in America. The myth of merit. The belief that titles and tradition are proof of integrity, that robes are proof of righteousness, that power by nature deserves deference. What Jasmine showed the world, what she made undeniable, is that none of those things are true without accountability. And accountability only exists when someone is brave enough to ask, who gave you that power? And why haven't you earned it? This wasn't just about a courtroom. It wasn't just about a hearing. It was about every woman who's ever walked into a room and been told she didn't belong there because her voice didn't sound right, or her skin didn't look right, or her questions made people uncomfortable. It was about every person who's ever been passed over, looked past, talked down to, and then gaslit when they tried to name it. Jasmine stood not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she knew what it meant to have no one else willing to stand with you. And that's the moral heartbeat of this story. When no one shields you, when no one lifts you up, standing becomes the most radical act you can commit. Justice, real justice, doesn't happen in marble chambers or behind closed doors. It happens when someone demands it, out loud and in full view of those who've spent lifetimes learning how to silence dissent. It happens not when the system reforms itself, but when someone refuses to carry its silence anymore. Jasmine Crockett didn't confront the Chief Justice of the United States. She interrupted a ritual, a centuries-old performance in which power pretends to be neutral, while the rest of the room is expected to play along. She broke that script. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that justice cannot exist where courage is punished and silence is rewarded. But perhaps the most piercing lesson isn't about what she said, it's about what he didn't. John Roberts, a man entrusted with the highest judicial authority in the land, had every chance to clarify, to correct, to protect the dignity of someone wrongly accused, even if it wasn't his intent. But he chose not to, and that choice revealed the most dangerous kind of injustice, the kind that hides behind politeness, the kind that smiles while it denies, the kind that speaks in generalities so it never has to take responsibility. Jasmine named that cowardice for what it was. And in doing so, she exposed a truth far more threatening than corruption. It was apathy in power. And that's the enemy of democracy. This is the story of a woman who was arrested for protesting injustice at 19, and decades later, faced down the most powerful judge in America without flinching. She didn't do it with anger. She did it with memory. She carried every insult, every microaggression, every slammed door, and whispered doubt into that hearing room and turned them into testimony, not for herself, but for every young girl who's ever been told to smile more, for every first-gen law student who's ever been told they don't fit, for every black woman who's ever been called too much and then too little in the same breath. Jasmine Crockett spoke for all of them, and for once the world listened. The moral of this story is not that power is bad. It's that power without introspection is dangerous. That tradition without truth is a lie. That ethics are not self-assigned, they are proven. And above all, that dignity doesn't flow from robes or gavels or Senate seats. It flows from the willingness to stand for what is right, even when you are standing alone. Because sometimes the robe doesn't symbolize wisdom, it hides from it. And sometimes the person who enters the room with the least protection leaves with the most truth. And so the next time someone says, "You're not qualified," remember this moment. Remember the silence that followed her question, the tremble in power when it was finally forced to look at itself. Remember the woman who stood, not because she was invited, but because she had earned the right to speak through fire. And remember that the world does not change because the powerful allow it. It changes because the brave insist. Qualification is not about pedigree. It's not about proximity to power. It's about what you do when the lights are brightest and the silence is deepest. It's about what you say when no one else will speak. And it's about whether your truth, when spoken aloud, makes the world a little more just or leaves it untouched. Jasmine Crockett made the world shake that day, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with truth. And in that truth, we found something rare. Not just a moment of accountability, but a blueprint for courage. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in the story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a heated congressional hearing over a 10-year-old rape victim forced to give birth, Jasmine Crockett took just 5 minutes to dismantle Marjorie Taylor Greene. Live, on camera. One calm question silenced Greene and exposed the brutal truth behind so-called pro-life laws. The room froze. The internet exploded. And this moment is now being called the most honest thing Congress has witnessed in years. How long will it take before the pain of a child matters more than a political victory? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C., 9:03 a.m. The marble floors of the Rayburn House office building echoed under hurried steps as reporters flooded through security checkpoints, their voices low but urgent, cameras already rolling. The hearing room, normally cold, bureaucratic, sterile, had transformed into something closer to a battleground. Every seat was taken. Congressional aides lined the back wall like silent sentinels. Flashes from news crews painted the polished wood panels with white-hot bursts of light. At the center of this storm, a simple placard read, "Hearing on Federal Oversight of Reproductive Health Policy." But everyone knew what this was really about. A 10-year-old girl in rural Texas had been raped. She became pregnant. And under the newly enacted state law, she was denied the right to terminate the pregnancy. The nation had watched in horror. Now it was time for Congress to answer, though no one agreed on what the question even was. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat high on the dais, flanked by aides with tightly clutched binders and folded arms. Her blonde hair immaculately pinned, expressions sharp as broken glass, she tapped her fingernails rhythmically against the microphone, like a metronome counting down to conflict. Greene had long positioned herself as a crusader for the unborn, but today she looked like a general preparing for war. She stared straight ahead, lips curled slightly, as if daring anyone in the room to flinch. Opposite her, seated calmly, but with a barely concealed tension in her jaw, was Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her deep brown eyes scanned the room, not for allies, but for the inevitable attack. dressed in black, with a single silver pin in the shape of Texas over her heart. Crockett looked like someone who had buried too many truths to be polite today. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. This was a moral collision. The room fell into silence as the chairwoman called the hearing to order. But it wasn't a respectful silence. It was loaded, like a breath held too long, like the split second before lightning hits. Every journalist in the room knew this moment would define headlines for weeks. Every witness sitting at the long table before the committee glanced nervously at the representatives. These were not scientists or academics. They were doctors, nurses, and one young woman who had once faced a pregnancy at 13. Their presence said more than any statistic could. But in that room, their testimonies were merely accessories to the main event, the ideological showdown between Green and Crockett. Red versus blue, control versus choice, faith versus fear, and above all, power cloaked in morality. And then, as if the silence itself had given her permission, Marjorie Taylor Greene struck like a match to gasoline. She leaned forward, posture rigid, voice soaked in condescension. "They call this a right?" she spat, eyes flashing as she reached beneath the desk. "Number, this is state-sanctioned murder." With a dramatic flick of her wrist, she unfurled a glossy trifold of printed images. Graphic, jarring, grotesque depictions of terminated fetuses, frozen mid-development like torn wings of something once human. She slammed them down one by one across the dais, their laminated surfaces flashing under the overhead lights. "Tell me, who speaks for them?" she challenged, voice rising like a preacher whipping a congregation into fury. "You sit here defending the rights of predators while the voiceless die in silence." Cameras zoomed in. Even some Republican aides looked away. The images weren't just provocative. They were psychological warfare, and Green knew it. The gallery reacted in waves, gasps, shifting chairs, murmurs like distant thunder. Journalists scribbled in frenzy. One congressman from Nevada looked physically ill. But Green wasn't done. She was performing, and she knew the script well. She turned sharply toward the center witness table, jabbing a finger at the young trauma nurse from El Paso who'd volunteered to testify. "You enable this," she barked. "You and your so-called compassion clinics, factories of death wrapped in a pink ribbon." The nurse's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she didn't speak. Crockett, meanwhile, remained still as stone. But her eyes, they locked onto Green's like two storm fronts preparing to collide. What made it unbearable wasn't just the rhetoric. It was the blatant spectacle of cruelty paraded as morality. Green wasn't there to debate. She was there to indict. Not a person in that room was safe from her accusations, especially not those who had seen the consequences of these laws up close. Her display wasn't for justice. It was for fear, for power, for control. And for a moment, it felt like the entire room had forgotten what real justice even looked like. But Crockett hadn't. She was waiting, measuring, letting the storm crash first, so her thunder would echo louder. But Green wasn't finished. Her hand still hovered over the table like a dealer with more cards to throw, and this next hand was aimed squarely at the press. She pivoted with a venomous grace, eyes sweeping the rows of reporters with barely concealed contempt. "Let's talk about who's really pulling the strings," she sneered, voice rising with theatrical cadence. "CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, all of them complicit. They don't just report the news anymore. They engineer it. They glorify abortion, they sanitize the horror, and they shove it down our throats under the disguise of women's health." She held up a printed article titled, "Abortion Access Saves Lives," and waved it like a weapon. "This is not journalism," she barked. "This is propaganda." Her finger stabbed the air. "You people are the problem. You've built a culture that worships death and calls it progress." The cameras kept rolling, zooming tighter with every sentence. Somewhere in the back, a boom mic wobbled from a trembling grip. A young reporter lowered his camera for a second, unsure if he was filming a hearing or a hostage video. Green's tone dipped into fire and brimstone fury. "You praise women for speaking their truth, but silence the ones who regret their abortions. You publish op-eds about bodily autonomy, but bury the stories of babies left to die after failed terminations. That's not freedom of the press. It's the manipulation of a nation. The journalists, for once, had no follow-up. Their pens slowed. Her eyes scanned the gallery like a sniper measuring her next shot. And on the other side of the room, Jasmine Crockett finally moved, just slightly, but her presence shifted like the pressure drop before a storm. Because Green hadn't just launched an attack on reproductive rights, she had declared war on the very voices who dared to challenge her version of reality. And in that moment, the injustice felt personal, deliberate, designed. A full frontal assault not just on facts, but on those who lived with the consequences of their absence. And Crockett, still silent, felt every word like a match head scraping stone, waiting, sparking, burning. And with the media thoroughly scorched in her verbal firestorm, Green turned her sights to the ideological heart of the hearing. Ready to deliver a blow meant not just to land, but to wound. She straightened her spine, as if rising into some imagined moral high ground, and lowered her voice into something slower, more calculated, like a blade being drawn. "Let's call it what it really is," she said, her southern drawl thickening with theatrical weight. "This so-called right to choose, it's not about women's health. It's about convenience. It's about escaping responsibility." Her words dripped with disdain, each one more poisonous than the last. "You're not fighting for freedom. You're fighting for the right to walk away from consequences." She paused, letting that sink in, letting the silence swell like a bruise. Then, with a tilt of her head and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she dropped the line meant to cut deepest. "We protect the unborn. Tiny hearts, tiny hands, tiny souls. And you," she turned to Crockett directly, voice laced with venom, "who exactly are you protecting?" The room tensed like a muscle before impact. Aides looked up from their phones. The nurse witness at the center table instinctively shifted back in her seat. A ripple of discomfort moved across the Democratic side of the aisle. But instead of rising to the bait, Jasmine Crockett did something far more dangerous. She remained silent. The room, already wound tight, seemed to draw itself inward. Breath held, eyes narrowing on the woman who refused to blink. Crockett sat perfectly still, the only movement coming from the slow glide of her pen across her notepad. Methodical, deliberate, like a surgeon charting incisions before an operation. Her jaw was tight, clenched just enough to betray restraint, and her eyes, God, those eyes, burned with a fury so contained it could have set the walls on fire. The camera found her and didn't look away, zooming in just close enough to catch the twitch in her temple, the tightening around her mouth, the fire behind her stare. She didn't scribble angrily. She wrote with the calm of someone who knew the exact weight of her words before speaking them. A staffer behind her adjusted in their seat, sensing it too. Something was building. Crockett didn't need to yell to be heard. She didn't need to flail to be feared. She was waiting, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was crafting a reckoning. In that moment, every insult Green had just hurled about responsibility, about morality, about who deserved protection, hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. But Crockett knew better than to chase smoke. She was watching the flame, watching Green, and waiting for the precise moment to strike. Not with outrage, but with evidence. Not with volume, but with truth. Because this wasn't just politics for her. This was personal. This was home. This was about every woman she had ever known who had been talked over, shut down, or legislated into silence. And when Crockett finally opened her mouth, the silence would not return. And while Crockett sat in controlled stillness, like a storm eyeing its path, the tension around her began to shift, subtly but unmistakably. On the Democratic side of the aisle, glances passed like signals in a battlefield trench. A congresswoman from Illinois leaned in slightly, eyes darting toward Crockett, then back to her notes, bracing. A representative from California, arms folded, gave the smallest nod as if to say, "It's time." They knew her reputation. Jasmine Crockett didn't swing unless she was sure the blow would land, and when it did, it never missed. A junior staffer seated a few rows behind whispered to no one in particular, "This hearing's going viral before lunch. I'd bet my badge on it." His colleague beside him didn't even look up, just murmured, "She hasn't said a word, and yet she's already winning." There was a current in the room now, electrified by what hadn't happened yet. Crockett was loading her ammunition. Not bullets, but truth. And once she fired, no one would be able to hide behind party lines or righteous outrage. The Republican side tried to maintain composure, but even they could feel it. A few exchanged whispers, some checked their phones as if searching for a distraction, an anchor, anything to break the gathering weight. Green, for all her confidence, adjusted her blazer and glanced once, only once, toward the woman she had just tried to humiliate. Crockett didn't return the look. She didn't need to. She was too busy preparing to drag the entire narrative into the light, one cold, undeniable fact at a time. Because everyone knew, the quieter she was now, the louder it would echo when she finally stood. And then, like a storm rolling in without thunder, Jasmine Crockett leaned into her mic and let the silence break. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with something far more dangerous. Truth delivered in a voice that refused to tremble. "If you've ever rushed your daughter to the emergency room at 3 in the morning, she began, her tone calm but deep with something heavier than rage, reality, then maybe, just maybe, you'd understand that this issue, it's not black and white. It's not about party lines. It's about what happens in the dark when no one is watching, when a child wakes up bleeding, in pain, scared out of her mind, and the only thing more terrifying than what's happening to her body is knowing there's no legal way out." Her words moved slowly, intentionally, like someone laying down bricks in a wall meant to stand forever. "I've seen those nights. I've answered those calls. And no mother, no father, should ever have to look at a 12-year-old child and say, 'There's nothing we can do. The law won't let us.'" She reached down and lifted a page from the folder in front of her, unfolding it with the reverence one gives a name of the dead. "This," she said, holding it just above the microphone, "is a CDC report from 2022. It tells us that girls under the age of 15 are 5 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than adult women." She looked directly at Green now, voice still even but firmer. "That's not a talking point. That's not liberal media spin. That is a number, born of autopsy tables and hospital beds. It's real, it's measurable, and it is ignored." Her eyes swept across the room, catching faces that suddenly couldn't meet hers. "Do you know what it means to bury a child who didn't even live long enough to understand what was done to her?" she asked. "Because that's what we're dealing with here. Not hypotheticals, not partisan fantasies, but little girls with soft voices and tiny hands who are forced to carry a pregnancy they didn't ask for, didn't want, and may not survive." She inhaled, held it. The air thickened, like something sacred had just been spoken. "And yet somehow we call that policy." Then her voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in weight. "I need everyone in this room to hear me very clearly. This isn't just about rights. This is about risk. And if you can look me in the eye and say a child's life is worth sacrificing to prove a political point, then the blood isn't just on your hands, it's on your soul." She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just let the truth hang there, heavy, unmovable, and devastatingly clear. And after letting the numbers land like thunder, Crockett allowed the room to breathe, just for a second, before guiding it straight into the eye of the storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power came not from volume, but from clarity, from truth so sharp it made people flinch. "She was 10 years old," Crockett began again, slower this time, each word like a stone being laid in the foundation of something unshakable. 10 years. Old. Her voice didn't crack, but something in it lowered, as if speaking this truth required the strength from someplace deeper. "I'm not going to say her last name. Not here, not in this room, because she's not a headline to be recycled or a case file to be debated. She was a child." Crockett's eyes drifted briefly to the back of the room, where a small group of nurses sat with arms folded, jaws tight. "Her first name was Alina. That's all I'll give you. That's all she should have had to give anyone. She was taken to the ER in Texas by her aunt," she continued, pressing forward. "The aunt didn't know what else to do. There was blood. A lot of it. Alina thought she was dying. Crockett's hands lay flat on the desk now, grounded. She didn't understand the pain or the swelling or why her stomach had started to change. She didn't know what was happening inside her because no one had ever explained it, because no one expected a 10-year-old to need that kind of conversation. Her voice lowered. She still slept with the lights on. She still watched cartoons before bed. She still believed in Santa Claus. And when they wheeled her into that hospital room, that cold white room that smelled like antiseptic and sounded like beeping monitors and muffled fear, she was still holding her teddy bear. Crockett paused, staring directly at the panel now. Let me repeat that for every member of this committee who wants to argue about legal precedent or states' rights, she was holding a stuffed animal. That's who your laws cornered. That's who your policies backed into a cage. Her fingers curled slightly on the desk, not in anger, but in control. She was 10. She should have been worrying about spelling quizzes or what snacks she'd bring to a sleepover. Instead, she was forced to carry a pregnancy that her body could barely survive, because adults in this country decided that her trauma was less important than their politics. The stillness that followed wasn't silence. It was gravity. It was weight, pressing into the bones of everyone in the room. No one moved. No one dared. Crockett let it hang, let it settle into the cracks of their arguments, into the corners of their pre-written talking points. Alina asked one of the nurses if the baby would come out with a bow, she said, like the ones on the dolls in commercials. She didn't even know where the baby was going to come from. Her voice was almost a whisper now, but somehow louder than anything Green had shouted. She didn't know what sex was. She didn't understand why her body was hurting. She only knew that everyone around her was afraid, and that the law told them they couldn't help her. And you call that protection, Crockett said, now looking directly at Green. You call that defending the innocent? She didn't blink. You tell the world you're saving lives, but what you're really doing is sacrificing little girls to protect your political purity. Then she leaned back slowly, deliberately. So the next time you hold up a poster of a fetus or wave a Bible in someone's face, I want you to remember this. Somewhere, in this country, there is a 10-year-old girl staring at a ceiling, holding a bear that's soaked in her tears, and wondering why no one ever came to save her. And in that moment, Crockett didn't just command the room, she changed it. And just as the chamber seemed to collapse into silence beneath the unbearable truth of Alina's story, it happened, predictably, violently, and with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Marjorie Taylor Greene's voice cracked through the air like a siren in a cathedral. No one forced her to give birth, she barked, her words sharp and shrill, slicing the tension but not the truth. Her knuckles whitened against the edge of the desk as she leaned in, posture forward like a woman trying to shove the room back with her chest. She chose life. Her family made that decision. They had options and they chose the right one. Her voice trembled with something more raw than conviction. Panic. Not panic of being wrong, but panic of being exposed. You sit here painting this child as a victim of the law, but she's alive, isn't she? That's what you people forget. She's alive. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled. Green's voice kept climbing, frantic now, a woman grasping for moral high ground as it crumbled under her feet. You act like she was dragged into that hospital in chains, that some cruel judge signed her womb into service. That's not what happened. Her fist slammed once on the table, the sound hollow, performative. Her aunt had a choice. Her doctors had a choice. Her family could have broken the law, but they didn't. They chose life. She pointed at Crockett now, finger trembling, eyes glassy with fury or desperation. It was hard to tell. So don't come in here with your sanctimonious tears and your one-sided sob stories trying to shame the rest of us into thinking we're the monsters. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't even blink. What Green failed to understand, what the entire room was about to learn, is that Crockett had stopped playing by the rules of televised outrage a long time ago. She wasn't here to win airtime. She was here to end the illusion. And she began not with fire, but with frost. She was 10, Crockett said, each syllable deliberate, carved in ice. She was raped by someone she trusted, She didn't understand what was happening to her body. She thought she had a stomach bug. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it deepened, like the earth opening just enough to show what lies beneath. She didn't understand pregnancy. She didn't understand trauma. She didn't understand choice. And you're sitting here telling this country, telling every parent watching this, that that child who still needed help reaching the sink to brush her teeth made a fully autonomous, legally sound decision to carry her rapist child to term? Her words did not echo. They hung in the air, on the walls, in the back of every throat in that room. She couldn't ride a bike without training wheels. She didn't know how her own body worked. But you, Congresswoman Green, are calling that a choice? Crockett leaned forward now, not to shout, but to cut deeper. That wasn't a decision. That was a death sentence disguised as obedience. And you're applauding it like it was heroism. Green slammed her hand on the table again. You people don't care about truth. You only care about headlines. Her voice cracked as she practically screamed. You use blood, actual blood, to buy votes. You parade around these tragedies like trophies, turning them into attack ads. That's what you do. Her voice was ragged, a jagged edge of desperation. You want dead babies so you can call it freedom. The chairwoman tried again. Order, she said louder this time. But the hearing had already crossed into territory where rules didn't apply. Order, or I will gavel this room. Still, the yelling continued. Green shouting, aides murmuring, a reporter gasping somewhere near the back. But Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. Her gaze didn't waver. Her voice, when it returned, was a scalpel. You scream about life, she said, steady as a heartbeat. But the only life you seem to care about is the one that can't ask you for food, or health care, or protection. Her tone sharpened. You say we use blood to win elections? But what about the blood on your laws? What about the blood of a 10-year-old girl who didn't even know what birth control was? Her hands, flat on the table, didn't shake. You want to protect a heartbeat you can't hear, but you ignore the cries of a child you could. Another beat. A pause so loud it silenced the room more than the gavel ever could. This isn't about life, Crockett said finally. It's about control. Control over bodies you'll never bleed from, never carry pain in, never bury trauma inside. You don't want to save children, you want to own them. Own their choices, own their futures, own their silence. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just take the floor, she became it. Unshakable, unignorable. And for the first time in the hearing, Marjorie Taylor Greene had nothing left to say. And as the echoes of Greene's outburst faded into something small and embarrassed, Jasmine Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply reached down, quiet and deliberate, and brought out what she had been saving. Not a speech, but evidence. A thick folder, frayed at the edges, worn like it had been read and reread in long nights by someone who knew every story inside was not a number, not a statistic, but a wound. She placed it on the desk with the reverence of someone setting down a headstone, not for one, but for many. No one breathed. She flipped it open slowly, fingers steady, not for effect, but because rushing truth is how it gets lost. Her voice didn't rise. It settled. You want to talk about justice? She said, not accusing, just asking a question no one in the room would be able to answer honestly. Then let's talk about what that word really means for women in America today. She picked up the first sheet. Her eyes didn't waver. Latice Fisher, Mississippi, 2017, a mother of 3. She gave birth to a stillborn baby at home. She called for help. She was arrested, charged with second-degree murder. Her internet search history on how to safely terminate a pregnancy was used as evidence of intent. She didn't pause for dramatic effect. She paused for her dignity. The next page slid out like a verdict. Brittany Poolaw, Oklahoma, 2021. She was just 20 years old. Addicted, yes. Poor, yes. But when she miscarried at 17 weeks, the state charged her with manslaughter. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison for losing a pregnancy she never had the support to manage. Crockett looked up now, not to accuse, but to witness, to make sure everyone heard. Marcy Jones, Alabama, 2019. She was 5 months pregnant when she was shot in the stomach during an argument. Shot. The fetus died. The shooter walked free. She was the one arrested, charged with manslaughter for not protecting the life of her unborn child. A bitter breath passed through the chamber. Even some of Green's aides had gone still. She was shot, and they blamed her. Crockett let the silence speak for a heartbeat longer, then raised the folder slightly off the table. There are more. So many more. Louisiana, Arizona, Tennessee, women investigated after miscarriages, jailed for stillbirths, denied counsel, shamed, alone. No lawyer, no doctor, just questions like, what did you do to lose that baby? As if every ounce of grief hadn't already swallowed them whole. She set the folder down again with finality, not to close it, but to ground it. Her voice grew heavier now, like it carried the weight of every woman inside those pages. They weren't criminals. They weren't threats. They weren't monsters. She leaned forward, steady, unflinching. They were poor. They were brown. They were forgotten. And what happened to them wasn't about law. It was about control. It was about telling every other woman in this country, this is what happens if you step out of line. Crockett placed her hand flat on the folder, fingers splayed, as if to shield the stories inside. You want to call that pro-life? I call it cruelty dressed in courtroom robes. I call it punishment without crime. I call it grief being dragged into jail cells and left there to rot. Her voice softened, barely. You think these laws stop abortion? Number, they don't. They just punish pain. They criminalize tragedy. They bury women before they're even dead. She looked directly into the camera now, not for politics, but for the people watching who had been afraid to speak. If you've lost a pregnancy and feared someone might accuse you of murder, you're not alone. If you've been scared to go to the hospital, scared to tell a nurse the truth, you are not the only one. She tapped the folder once, just once, like a judge with a gavel, except this was no trial, this was a reckoning. This isn't just paperwork, this is the future, unless we change it. And as the last echoes of Crockett's voice faded into the walls like the closing notes of a requiem, the entire hearing room seemed to stop breathing. Not a chair creaked, not a paper rustled. Even the hum of electronics and faint coughs that normally colored the air in Capitol chambers vanished into a void of reverent stillness. And in that void, all eyes turned, slowly, unavoidably, to Marjorie Taylor Greene. The cameras caught it before the humans did. A slow pan, a gentle zoom, the kind of movement used in film when the director wants to show the precise second something breaks. Her face, moments earlier, bold, blistering, full of fire, was now motionless, like she'd been hit not by words but by something heavier. Truth, grief, exposure. Her eyes, usually so quick to flash with defiance, seemed unsure where to land. She looked to her right, then left, then down at the table as if it might offer her a script, a lifeline, anything to interrupt the freefall she suddenly found herself in. Her lips parted, just slightly, as if forming the first syllable of a rebuttal. But nothing came, not even a breath. Her tongue pressed against her teeth, then retreated, her jaw clenched, not from strength, but from the effort of holding back whatever instinct came next. To yell, to cry, to flee, to disappear. But she was stuck, and worse, she was visible. Not just to those in the chamber, but to the entire country watching from laptops, phones, televisions. There was no spin in her eyes now, no swagger, no smirk. She tried to blink, but even that looked delayed, like her brain couldn't catch up with what had just happened. Her signature armor, rhetorical aggression, media-savvy provocation, performative patriotism, none of it mattered in this moment. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just out-argued her. She'd dismantled the scaffolding Greene had built her entire political identity on. She hadn't shouted her down. She hadn't insulted her. She had exposed her. With facts, with stories, with names, with truth so raw and so specific that no one, not even Greene herself, could deny what it meant. And now Greene sat there, live on national television, with every light on her and no shadows to retreat into. Her hands were clasped too tightly, her shoulders drawn up, subtly defensive. Her mouth moved again, as if to say something, anything. But again, the silence won. It was louder than her voice had ever been. One of her aides leaned forward slightly, like they were ready to jump in, to reset the rhythm, to whisper an escape hatch. But they didn't, because there was no salvaging this moment. There was only enduring it. And in that exact frame, the camera held unwavering, Marjorie Taylor Greene looked no longer like a warrior. She looked like a woman who had just been seen for the first time without the shield of outrage, the armor of slogan, the mask of certainty. And what was revealed underneath wasn't strength, it was smallness. The kind that comes when the noise runs out and all that's left is the truth, and how little room you had left to stand in. This was the moment no edit could erase, no spin could recover. It wasn't dramatic because someone yelled. It was unforgettable because someone finally couldn't. And as the tension from Crockett's last words still rippled through the hearing room like the aftershock of something far more seismic than speech, she didn't pull back. She didn't allow the silence to settle into comfort. Instead, she leaned forward again, slow and deliberate, locking her eyes onto Marjorie Taylor Greene with a kind of unwavering focus that made the entire room feel like it had tilted in that direction. There was no fire in her expression, no outrage, just truth. Cold, director, inescapable. Her voice was quieter now, but sharper. Let me ask you something. Not as a politician, not as an opponent, but as a mother. She paused, not for drama, but to let the words settle into the soil of Greene's defenses. If your daughter, your own child, came to you one day, crying, terrified, and told you she had been raped, would you look her in the eye and say, "You have to keep that baby"? Would you force her to carry a daily reminder of her trauma, of her pain, of what was taken from her? Crockett's tone never rose. It didn't need to, because it wasn't a question designed to provoke. It was a question designed to expose. The room was dead still. Greene didn't answer. She blinked once, then again, and her eyes flicked away. Not toward her staff, not toward the camera, but to some vague middle distance, like she was searching for an exit that wasn't there. Her hand moved, barely, and rested on the edge of the desk. Not confident, not firm. It gripped the wood with the tension of someone holding themselves still, as if movement might shatter whatever mask she had left. Her lips parted slightly. For a second, it seemed like she might say something, but nothing came. Nothing she could say would survive the weight of that question. And Crockett just watched her, not with malice, but with the clarity of someone who had sat across from too many women with shaking hands and hollow eyes. Women who had been told they had to endure, that they had no choice. She wasn't asking for a gotcha moment. She was asking because somebody had to, because too many lawmakers had written laws with ink but never with empathy, because this question wasn't hypothetical in the real world. It was horrifyingly, devastatingly common. Then Crockett spoke again, even softer this time, her voice almost like a prayer, except there was no comfort in it. No one, she said, the words slow and deliberate, should be forced to live in hell because of what someone else did to them. She let the weight of that truth fall. It didn't need explanation. It didn't need elaboration. It was the kind of truth that cuts clean. Around the chamber, no one moved. No one whispered. Even the chairwoman sat in stillness. And Greene, so often the loudest, so often the one with an answer for everything, sat frozen, her silence wrapped around her like a second skin, cracking at the seams. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett had not only asked a question no one wanted to answer, she had revealed just how cruel the silence really was. And as the hearing slowly returned to order, as the chairwoman finally found her voice again to move the agenda forward, everyone in that room knew the moment had already passed them by, and it was never coming back. The words had been spoken. The silence had done its damage. The truth had landed like a meteor. What followed now, procedure, protocol, posturing, was hollow noise compared to the reckoning that had just occurred under the bright lights of the committee room. But outside those walls, everything was just beginning. Because the cameras hadn't just recorded it. The internet had consumed it. Within minutes, the clip surfaced. First from a staffer's shaky phone footage uploaded to Twitter, captioned in all caps. Crockett just bodied MTG in real time. Then came the official C-SPAN cut. Clean angles, perfect audio, a 5-minute monologue that felt more like a closing argument in a trial no one realized they were on the jury for. By noon, it had passed 100,000 views. By evening, it was trending on TikTok, stitched into montages with dramatic music, black and white filters, and phrases like, "This is how you carry the truth into battle." But what made it viral wasn't just the content, it was the feeling. It wasn't politics, it was real. No talking points, no shouting matches. Just a woman refusing to blink while demanding the country look itself in the mirror. On a farm just outside Chillicothe, Ohio, 67-year-old Doug Weller watched the video on his phone in the cab of his combine. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, dust catching gold in the air, and Doug sat there long after the clip ended. He ran a hand down his face, then replayed the part where Crockett asked, "Would you force your own daughter?" He didn't have a daughter. He had 3 sons. But for some reason, the question sat on his chest like weight he'd never felt before. Later that night, he typed a comment under a repost of the video on Facebook. It said simply, "I don't agree with everything she stands for, but that right there, that was the first time I've seen someone tell the truth without trying to sell it." In a diner off Route 12 in Kansas, 2 retired school teachers pulled the video up on a cracked tablet, watching between bites of pecan pie. One turned to the other and whispered, "She said what we used to be afraid to teach." In a high school civics class in Detroit, a student asked their teacher, "Why don't they all talk like that?" On a bus ride through Atlanta, a teenage girl with headphones on took them out. Mid-video, just to show the woman sitting next to her. "Watch this," she said, eyes wide. "She's not playing." The most powerful feedback didn't come from pundits or anchors. It came from people like Rosa, a single mother in San Antonio, who sent Crockett's office an email with no subject line, just 5 words in the body, "Thank you for seeing us." Or from Malik, a former pastor in Birmingham, who posted on Threads, "My faith tells me to value life, but this woman reminded me that valuing life also means valuing mercy." Meanwhile, the backlash stirred, but it sounded flat, mechanical. Green posted a clip of her own, sliced at the most convenient angle, with a caption that screamed, "Democrats celebrate abortion while killing the family unit." But the comments beneath it told a different story. You didn't answer her question. She didn't yell. She didn't call you names. Why were you so shaken? You got quiet. That said everything. On cable news, the spin machine spun. Anchors framed the hearing as a sign of deepening partisan division. But the audiences didn't care about that angle. They weren't quoting the politics. They were quoting Crockett. Word for word. "You scream about life," she had said, "but you don't give a damn about the people living it." That line alone had been turned into 1,000 memes, graffiti on protest signs, stitched into t-shirts. Not because it was flashy, but because it was true. Inside her office, long after the hearing ended and the corridor lights dimmed, Jasmine Crockett sat with her back straight, eyes scanning the screen of her phone as hundreds of messages poured in. There were trolls, there were threats, there always were, but she focused on the ones that mattered. The one from a nurse in Georgia who wrote, "I watched a girl die from sepsis after a miscarriage because her doctor was too afraid to intervene. Thank you for not pretending this is okay." Or the voicemail from a trembling voice, barely above a whisper, "I was 13. I kept quiet. You didn't. Thank you." She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to hold the gravity of it all. She hadn't planned to go viral. She hadn't come to perform. She came to tell the truth. And for once, the country didn't just hear it, they felt it. Not in the way you feel a clever line or a good speech, but in the way you feel a warning siren in your bones. And somewhere, in a house she would never visit, A little girl sat at a kitchen table while her mother played the clip from her phone. The girl didn't understand all the words, not yet, but she saw something that stuck. A woman who didn't look away. A woman who didn't flinch. A woman who sat in the halls of power and said what needed to be said. Slowly, the girl reached for her homework. Math could wait. She wanted to write down that woman's name, Jasmine Crockett. Because sometimes the truth doesn't win the argument. Sometimes what ends it. And while the viral clips ricocheted through every corner of the internet, spliced, stitched, amplified into memes, montages, debates, there was something far more intimate, far more powerful unfolding beneath the noise. It didn't come with flashing headlines or blue check marks. It didn't make it onto cable panels or Twitter trends. It came in the quiet hum of inboxes, in the fragile ring of late-night voicemails, in the shaky scrawl of handwritten letters sliding through the Capitol mailroom. Messages from people who hadn't planned to speak, who never imagined they would. But Jasmine Crockett's words had opened something, something too old to name and too raw to contain. That night, as the lights of Washington dimmed and the echo of the hearing slowly slipped beneath the surface of a city built to forget, Crockett remained in her office, alone. The glow of her monitor cast soft shadows across the stacks of folders, policy drafts, coffee cups gone cold. She hadn't changed out of her suit. Her heels were still on. Her back was still straight. But her eyes, tired but alert, were fixed on a single open email. The subject line was blank, the sender unknown. But the words inside, they landed differently. My daughter watched your hearing beside me. She's 14. She cried, not because she was scared, but because for the first time someone said what I never had the courage to say. Thank you. The sender's name was Elise. Idaho, small town, no further details, no politics, no hashtags, just a mother writing from the edge of something so many women live on. Silence. Crockett stared at the message for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. What could she say to a mother who had carried her truth like a secret wound, only to have it cracked open by a stranger's voice through a screen? What could she offer to a daughter who had seen her mother's pain reflected back to her, not in suffering, but in strength? Crockett didn't know them. She probably never would. But this was no longer about names or places or party lines. This was about the invisible weight women carried until someone dared to speak it aloud. She rose from her chair, not fast, not slow, just steady. Her body ached with the fatigue of the day, but there was something deeper keeping her upright. Something rooted, something earned. She crossed the room toward the tall window overlooking the Capitol dome, its marble curves glowing soft beneath the night sky. It stood there timeless, unmoved by emotion. The same building that had crushed dreams, delayed justice, and sanitized suffering behind legislative language. The same building where policies were written in ink but enforced in blood. And yet, tonight, something had shifted. Not outside, not in the architecture, but in the air, in the quiet, in the people who had watched, not as voters but as witnesses. Crockett placed her hand against the glass. It was cold, unforgiving, but real, like the truth. She could see her reflection faintly. Dark eyes, a tired mouth, the faintest crease between her brows from years of frowning at injustice. She didn't look victorious. She looked tired. But there was no regret in her face. She let the silence linger for a while. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Full of everything left unsaid for too long. Full of voices that had been choked by fear, politics, power. Full of women like Elise, who had swallowed their pain because there had never been room for it in the conversation. Until now. Then just above a whisper, she spoke, not to the room, not even to herself, but to the space between policy and personhood. Policy is words, she murmured, but words decide the fate of real people. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That sentence was enough, a truth too simple for applause, too painful for sound bites. She stood there a moment longer, letting it settle, letting the weight of it fold into her bones. She thought of Alina, of Lettice, of Marche, of all the names in that folder and the ones that would never be written down. She thought of Elise, of Elise's daughter, and of the millions of women watching, not for entertainment, but for survival. Then slowly she stepped away from the window, not because she was done, but because the fight was far from over, and she knew now they weren't alone anymore. Morning in D.C. arrived as it always did, gray light creeping between marble columns, the city shaking off its sleep beneath layers of ceremony and noise. But inside the halls of Congress, something felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had listened to what was said the night before and were still carrying the weight of it. In Jasmine Crockett's office, the lights flicked on slowly. Her staff came in early, though none of them said much. They didn't need to. The air was thick with aftershock, not from scandal, but from truth. The inbox had filled overnight, hundreds of new messages. Some came from recognizable names, editors, state representatives, legal scholars. But most were anonymous, first names only, cities barely known, rural zip codes with no mayor and maybe one high school. Women who didn't know they had something to say until Crockett's voice cracked something inside them open. An aide sat quietly reading through the subject lines. "Thank you for seeing us. I lost a baby. I went to jail. I've never told anyone this, but..." There were thousands of them, raw, shaking, furious, grateful. Some were paragraphs long, pouring out stories that had never been spoken aloud. Others were a single line, "She said what I couldn't." In a small rural town in Arkansas, a midwife named Carla wrote that she'd walked away from her practice because the fear of prosecution outweighed her ability to help. In Ohio, a former deputy sheriff sent in a 2-sentence message. "I arrested a woman for a miscarriage once. I can't sleep." But it wasn't just women writing. A mechanic in Montana said he watched the hearing while fixing a carburetor. His niece had been assaulted 2 years earlier. The family hid it. No one called the police. He'd always thought that was wrong until he watched Crockett speak. "Now I get it," he wrote. "We didn't trust the system to treat her like a person. You proved we were right." In a church in Mississippi, a pastor told his congregation, "What she said may make you uncomfortable, but the cross wasn't built for comfort. It was built for truth." And in a Native American reservation in South Dakota, a grandmother gathered her daughters and granddaughters in her trailer and replayed the clip again and again, translating slowly, pausing after every line Crockett said. Her voice trembled when she reached the part, "No one should be forced to live in hell because of someone else's crime." She stopped the Sheila video, looked at the girls around her and said, "We don't have to be quiet anymore." Across the country, something had begun to shift. Not a revolution, not yet, but a reckoning, a recognition that the lives policy forgets are real, that dignity isn't a political agenda, it's a right. In town after town, Crockett's voice had done something no media campaign or televised debate could. It humanized pain. It stripped away the slogans, the fundraising language, the carefully rehearsed statements, and forced people, many for the first time, to confront what these laws really did, what they cost. In Kentucky, a nurse practitioner wrote, "You're the first person I've seen talk about miscarriage like it's not a crime scene. Thank you. I've watched too many women beg for help while doctors stood frozen, afraid of prison." In Utah, a teenage girl recorded a voice message in tears. "I was raped last year. I didn't tell my mom. I was going to kill myself. But I watched you and I realized I'm not the only one." And in the Bronx, a 72-year-old retired librarian wrote the simplest note of all. "I thought this country had forgotten how to feel. You reminded me it hasn't." Not every reaction was praise, of course. Some of the responses were vicious. Threats, screeds, accusations that she was promoting murder, that she was a disgrace to the nation, that she had no business speaking in public. But none of it stuck, not like her words had stuck, because those voices were loud, but hollow. The people writing from pain, they weren't loud, they were deep, and that depth resonated far longer than outrage ever could. Meanwhile, in media rooms and editorial boards, producers scrambled to catch up. The networks ran the clip late, buried between more comfortable stories. But they had to run it, because the public wasn't waiting for permission. They were already watching, already discussing, already remembering. In a living room in El Paso, a family of 5 watched the full hearing on YouTube. The father, who had voted Republican in every election since he was 18, turned to his wife and said, "I don't agree with everything she said, but she wasn't lying." His teenage daughter said nothing, just nodded, and then saved the video to her phone. At a barbershop in Atlanta, the hearing played on repeat. No sound, just subtitles. Every time Crockett's name appeared, the barbers would pause, lean in, shake their heads. One said, "She didn't flinch, man. You saw that? She looked Green dead in the eye and didn't flinch." In classrooms and hospitals and prisons, the hearing played, not as entertainment, not even as politics, but as a moment of clarity. It became required watching not because it was sensational, but because it was true. And back in D.C., the halls of Congress were quieter than usual. Staffers passed each other with nods instead of chatter. Even Green's team kept their heads down. There was nothing to spin. The footage was everywhere. The silence she couldn't fill had spoken for her. Inside Crockett's office, her team gathered mid-morning to debrief, but there was little to say, no strategy, no next move. They all felt the same thing. Something had shifted, not in the headlines, in the people, in the way they felt, in the way they were finally saying what they had carried in silence for too long. Crockett finally stepped into the room, coffee in one hand, the printed email from Elise in the other. Her team quieted. She looked at them, then at the stacks of new letters, messages, voices waiting to be heard. She set the coffee down, and in her voice there was no fanfare, no fire, just resolve. "Let's read them all," she said, "because policy doesn't change just from passion. It changes when people see that their pain has witnesses. It changes when voices rise, not in unison, but in truth." And Jasmine Crockett was ready to listen. Because yesterday she had spoken for them. Today she would fight for them. For most moments in politics, no matter how loud or shocking, the shelf life is short. Headlines cycle out in hours. Social media burns through outrage like dry grass, leaving only smoke behind. Even the biggest televised clashes fade beneath the weight of tomorrow's scandal, the next viral clip, the next story demanding attention. But not this time. Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't fade. It lingered. Not because she shouted louder, but because she didn't. Not because she dominated her opponent, but because she exposed something far more dangerous, a system that was willing to legislate pain and call it protection. Her words weren't crafted to trend. They weren't clean sound bites made for campaign ads. They were too real for that, too raw, too heavy to forget, and America didn't forget. In the weeks that followed, the clip continued to circulate, not just in progressive circles, not just among journalists or academics, but in communities that Washington had long dismissed as invisible. People who had stopped expecting anyone to speak for them suddenly found themselves replaying Crockett's words again and again. Not because they needed convincing, but because they needed validation. Proof that someone, somewhere in power, got it. In a small clinic in rural Nebraska, a nurse pinned Crockett's quote, "No one should be forced to live in hell because of someone else's crime," to a corkboard next to emergency hotline numbers. Patients read it while waiting for their prescriptions. One woman whispered, "That's the first time I've seen something on that wall that felt like it was written for me." In a community college in Oregon, a professor scrapped the last 2 weeks of her curriculum and replaced it with a new unit. When truth enters the room, language, law, and lived experience. She played the full 5-minute exchange from the hearing. Her students didn't take notes. They just listened. One student, a first-generation Latina, stayed after class and said quietly, "I thought I was crazy for feeling what I felt." But she made it feel real. It wasn't just young people, not just women, not just Democrats. Something deeper had cracked, something that had been stretched too far for too long without release. Crockett's voice had given it shape. At first, she avoided the interviews, declined the Sunday shows. She didn't want this moment twisted into a narrative of political branding, but eventually she agreed to speak, once. A local journalist from Dallas, a black woman, reached out. The two met in a quiet cafe, no cameras, just a mic between them. The conversation aired on public radio late on a Thursday night. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't flashy, it was just honest. "Were you trying to make a point?" the journalist asked. "No," Crockett said. "I was trying to stop the bleeding." That line echoed harder than any campaign slogan. After that, requests flooded in, not from networks, but from people. Town halls, health forums, teacher unions, survivor circles, not to campaign, not to give speeches, but just to talk, to sit down and be present in rooms where women still carry shame for miscarriages, where girls still whispered the word rape like it could curse the air, where parents wondered what they would do if it happened to their child, and realized they'd never dared to ask that question before. But Crockett showed up. She didn't come with cameras, she didn't bring consultants. She came with a notebook. And she listened. In one church basement in Tulsa, she sat across from a woman who had miscarried twins and then been interrogated by police for possible intent to self-induce. The woman sobbed through the story, ashamed, exhausted. Crockett held her hand. No words, just presence. That alone, the woman later said, made her feel more heard than all her court appearances combined. But Crockett didn't stop at listening. In Congress, she got to work. She co-sponsored a bill that demanded legal protections for women experiencing miscarriage and pregnancy loss. Simple, clear language. No arrests, no charges, no questions unless evidence of a violent crime exists. It wasn't a sweeping overhaul. It wouldn't fix everything. But it was a beginning. And that's how real change starts. Not in waves, but in seeds. The bill faced resistance, of course. It didn't pass. Not on the first try. But that wasn't the point. The point was that it existed, that it had a name, that the people who'd once been forced into silence now saw a document with language that reflected their lives, their pain, their right to not be punished for their bodies. And while Crockett continued the work, the country kept remembering. In Iowa, a high school held an essay contest. The topic, "Who do you trust to tell the truth?" Dozens of essays named Crockett. One student wrote, "She didn't sound like a politician. She sounded like someone who knew what pain felt like and refused to let it be ignored." In Texas, a group of mothers organized a donation drive for reproductive health clinics under a single quote, "Policy is words, but words decide the fate of real people." That sentence, spoken so quietly at the window, away from the cameras, had found its way onto murals, onto pins, onto billboards in places where women still drove 4 hours just to find a clinic. Because what Crockett had done wasn't just confront Green. It wasn't just win a debate or own the other side. It was deeper. She'd broken the fourth wall of political performance and reminded everyone, this isn't a show. These are real lives. These are real bodies. These are real consequences. And she never took credit for that. She didn't bask in the attention. She didn't try to spin it into a national brand, because that wasn't the goal. Crockett knew that when voices like hers get amplified, the world tries to contain them, to put them in a box, turn them into symbols. She refused that. She stayed present. She stayed real. And that's why the voice didn't fade, because it wasn't just her voice anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every parent who had been afraid, every child forced to grow up too soon, every person who had once asked, "Why does no one say it out loud?" and finally heard someone say it. And as she walked the Capitol halls months later, nothing about her had changed. Same suit, same stride, same stare. But the eyes that followed her were different. They weren't dismissive. They weren't mocking. They were watching, listening, respecting. Even those who disagreed couldn't pretend she hadn't altered the air. Because when a voice tells the truth in a place built on pretending, it doesn't just leave a mark. It shifts the floor beneath your feet. And now, no one in that room, no one watching, could ever walk the same way again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.